Hey guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. Today we're going to be discussing a very popular misinterpretation in the Bible prophecy community. It involves the idea that when Jesus spoke of the end times being like the days of Noah, that he was actually making a reference to the activity that was happening in Genesis 6, where we see that it talks about fallen angels mixing with human women to produce hybrid Nephilim, or giants. This has become a very common understanding of these words of Jesus, where he spoke of the days of Noah, mainly among recent Bible prophecy teachers. I'm going to show you today from the Bible itself that Nephilim, human hybrids, fallen angel activity, aliens, etc., is not at all what Jesus wanted his audience to understand when he spoke those exact words in his Olivet Discourse and also in Luke chapter 17, which also contains very similar teachings. And to reduce your interpretation to this Nephilim view will actually prevent you from seeing what Jesus was actually trying to convey. And what he was trying to convey had absolutely nothing to do with warning the first century disciples about aliens or human hybridization. It just didn't. Jesus had actually a very specific point that he was trying to get across. And when you simply read through this discourse plainly, it's quite obvious what his point was. So we're going to talk about that today. Now, the first thing that I want to say is that I am not in any way denying the angel view of Genesis 6. Not at all. I've actually written extensively on this subject of Genesis 6, the sons of God being fallen angels, and how we're told that they took human women and fathered giants that the Bible calls the Nephilim, or giants. And all of that is absolutely true. And if you want to look further into it, you can look up my study entitled The Identity of the Nephilim under the Studies tab on my website, letusreason.com. So in no way am I diminishing or denying that reality today. Exegetically, the angel view is really the only conclusion that you can come to if you're looking at it seriously. The opposing view, often called the Sons of Seth view, has absolutely no biblical merit, and it's just full of holes. But I say all of this at the beginning here just so you don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say in this video. But just because the angel view is correct, that doesn't mean that we should take things that Jesus says out of context in order to see the Nephilim in everything. That's a mistake. Some people, all they want to talk about all day is the Nephilim. That's all they talk about on their channel, and that seems to be their favorite subject. And so, there's this tendency in life where people see their own favorite subject in just about everything. Somebody who's an expert on aliens is going to see aliens behind everything. Somebody who buys into the blame the Jews movement, that somehow wicked Jews are behind all the evil that's in the world, well, they're going to see that in everything. And so many of our good Bible prophecy teachers, who I would agree with on a lot of issues, who are experts on the Nephilim, they fall into this same unfortunate tendency. But as we go through these passages today and just simply read them, and simply discuss them, and apply some basic logic and some reading comprehension, you're going to find that the Nephilim were at best remote from Jesus's actual context and intention in these days of Noah teachings. And let me also say, as we get started, that people do the exact same thing when Jesus equivalently mentions the destruction of Sodom in the days of Lot. People think that the biblical story that Sodom was a place of great homosexuality means that when Jesus mentioned this, that's what Jesus is referring to. So that because we see great homosexuality in our culture today, that Jesus is telling us that we're close to the end when he says that the time around his coming is going to be like the days of Lot. That's what they take from it. But that's not even close to what Jesus was saying. Not even close. Guys, we have to take the Bible seriously. And when you take it seriously, it requires that you treat it with reverence and respect, meaning you can't just read all of these things into it. You can't make it say whatever you want it to say. By doing that, you're ignoring what it actually says and what Jesus was actually intending for his audience on that day and for us today to understand in that teaching. We have to understand the Bible based on what the text is actually telling us. If the common sense or the literal, the plain, the contextual sense makes common sense or plain sense, then that's it. That's what we have to take it on. We have to accept what it says plainly. We can't come up with all these imaginative and colorful ways to insert our own views and our own favorite subjects. By doing that, you're essentially making yourself the author. You're replacing God and his own divine inspiration of the text, and you're replacing that with your own imagination. Guys, we can't do that. And so let's begin to take a careful look into these passages and understand the very simple, very obvious, very plain message that Jesus was actually communicating. Now, like I've already mentioned, these references of Jesus to the days of Noah take place in Luke chapter 17 and then in the Olivet Discourse. And Jesus uses this exact phrase in the exact same way where he refers to the days of Noah in all these instances. He's using it exactly the same, and he's communicating the exact same thing in all the instances where it's brought up. And what he's doing in all these chapters is he's teaching his disciples about eschatology, or the study of the end times. And he's teaching them about his return, or his coming, which is often translated from the Greek word parousia, the word coming. The parousia, or the return of Christ, which is going to take place after this present church age that we're living in right now, comes to an end. That's when the parousia begins. The parousia begins when the current church age comes to completion. Now, I don't have time to fully explain all of this, but let me just sort of summarize it quickly to help establish this context. Now, let me put out there that I write deeply about this in my book, The Missing Key, which you can see right over my shoulder on the fireplace. And I talk about it in other videos. Look back on my channel to see videos like The Olivet Discourse, Deciphering the Dilemma. But the entire context here is the day of the Lord, or what we like to refer to as the end times. Now, some people use this phrase, the end times, very loosely, and they apply it to today. No, we're in the church age right now, not the end times. The end times, or the day of the Lord, is what happens after the church age ends, or it comes to a completion. And then the day of the Lord is what follows. It's the next age. Now, don't confuse that with the way that the Bible speaks about the phrases the last days or the latter times, which include the church age, all the way back to the first coming of Christ. That's not what we're talking about here. Don't get it confused. We're talking about the end times. We're talking about eschatology, or the day of the Lord, where in all of these passages, Jesus is speaking about the sudden initiation of the day of the Lord. That's the context for why he's using days of Noah, as we'll see as we go. But the day of the Lord, as it's used in the Bible, I want to point out right now, lest you not be aware of this, is that it's a complex term. And you're not always going to hear this from people. They look at it in sort of a oversimplistic way. And when you do that, you miss some of the nuances, because it has some complexity or some nuances to it. And it's used to refer both to a time of culmination or climax. So it's used in that sense. So in other words, that would be the shorter term application, but it's also then used to refer to a longer period of time, a shorter context and a longer context, a culmination aspect and a broader context, which you'll hear me refer to as the broad period of the day of the Lord. You know, there's a culminating day, just like you think of the Christmas season in our modern times. There's a culminating day called Christmas Day on the 25th of December, or Christmas proper, you might call it, the actual day. But then we also sometimes refer to the entire month of December, and maybe even beyond that, as Christmas, or the Christmas season in this sense. So it's a broader context. So it depends on how we're using it. Well, the same is true about the day of the Lord and how it's used in the Bible, because it's used in these different ways. It's used in a broad way and a more confined or culminating way, a climactic way. There's times where it refers specifically to the culminating sense, which is when Jesus returns physically to the earth at the end of the 7-year tribulation, or Daniel's 70th week. But then there's also times when it refers to the broader context, which the tribulation as a whole is just a subset within. And that's also something that a lot of people don't understand. The tribulation is not the day of the Lord. And the tribulation doesn't begin the day of the Lord. The tribulation is a subset within the broader period called the day of the Lord. Also, the millennium is part of the broader sense of the period called the day of the Lord. So the millennium is part of the day of the Lord too. And in fact, if you look further into this, you're going to find that there seems to be even a period of time before the tribulation that's also part of the day of the Lord in its broad sense. I like personally to refer to it as the post-rapture gap period. And when you look even closer at this, you find that the rapture turns out to be the opening event that begins the day of the Lord in its broad sense. So, in other words, the rapture of the church is the initiation or the opening event of the broad period of the day of the Lord. And everything that follows the rapture, all the way until the ending of the millennial kingdom, is all included in the day of the Lord in its broad sense. So when I say the rapture, just understand that I'm also saying, from a timing perspective, the beginning of the broad day, because they happen at the same time. Now, like I said, I don't have time to prove all of that to you right now. It's not the topic of the video. It'd be a 5-hour video. But I have a lot of resources that are available to you for that. It's the subject of my book, or at least the main subject within it. But also there's articles, videos that are free, other free resources for you to better understand how I got there. Now, the next foundational term that's important for us to understand in this discussion is parousia, which I already mentioned. But you need to understand that the parousia, or Jesus is coming, is what's being spoken of when we refer to the rapture and beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord. So I don't want to make it too complex here. It's just different terms, but it's actually very simple. They all start at the same time. They're just different words or descriptions that are speaking of different things within it or referring to different aspects. So the Lord's coming has some complexity built into it, like we already mentioned. And so there's these different subsets within it and different things happening. And so there's some terms that we use to refer specifically to, one of those things, but we need to understand how they relate to one another. Sort of like the calendar. You could say that it's the beginning of 2025. You could say it's January 1st, and you could say it's New Year's Day. But you're all referring to the exact same moment in time. It's all the same. It focuses on it just in a different way based on what term you're using. Well, it's the same for what we're talking about here. The rapture, the parousia, the broad day of the Lord, the judgment phase of the broad day, all of it speaks of the same future moment in time that kicks off what we think of as the end times. Now, obviously, the rapture refers to the supernatural rescue of the righteous church. This is the opening event of the parousia, or the coming of Christ, which is an extended period. It begins with Jesus is coming to rescue his bride, the parousia, talking about. But the parousia also simultaneously begins the judgment on the wicked, the judgment phase of the broad period of the day of the Lord. It all starts at the same time, because the day of the Lord refers to this entire extended period that we call the end times. The day of the Lord initiates with salvation for the righteous, but simultaneous judgment starts to fall on the wicked. And that judgment continues then to build and to build until it climaxes at the moment of Jesus' physical coming to the earth to consummate his judgment of the wicked at the end of the tribulation. So all of that whole period is called his parousia, and you can also call it the judgment phase of the broad day of the Lord. It's the same exact time frame. That's why the beginning of this period of judgment, which you can see in Matthew 24 and verses 4-8, and I do recommend that you open your Bible to read through all of this, because we're not going to have time to go verse by verse in this video. But this beginning of judgment is what Jesus refers to as the beginning of birth pangs. Because like a woman in labor, the painful contractions begin at a certain moment, a certain point in time, a definite point in time, and then they continue to build and increase until the time of delivery, where they climax in intensity. That's what's happening as the broad day begins. The righteous people are removed, and the beginning of birth pang judgment starts on the wicked who are left behind. And they continue to build until they see the sign of his coming in the clouds at the end of the tribulation. which that's going to be the conclusion of this judgment phase of the broad day, when he comes back physically to the earth and executes his judgment and then sets up his kingdom for 1,000 years, which then is the blessing phase of the day of the Lord. So first it was the judgment phase, and then it's the blessing phase, but it's still the broad period of the day of the Lord until the end of the millennium. So the parousia is from the rapture until the end of the tribulation. And I hope you take the opportunity to screenshot the chart that I have on the screen so you can better put a picture with what I'm trying to describe. Or you can download it in high definition on my website. All right, so believe it or not, that was a quick summary of chronology and terms that you need to understand for us to even start to have this discussion, because the context of Jesus's usage of the days of Noah largely depends on you understanding the context of the Olivet Discourse in Luke 17, where he uses these phrases, which is all about what we just discussed. Where first he starts speaking about the signs in the Olivet Discourse, he speaks of the signs that take place throughout the judgment phase of the broad day of the Lord, not the church age, the judgment phase of the broad day of the Lord. And then at some point in the narrative, he switches his context to speak about the suddenness and the unpredictability of the absolute beginning of that entire period. So open up to Matthew 24 to see this. And I'll also put this chart on the screen for you to refer to in order to see the contrast. Because again, we don't have time to go through it all in a verse by verse format. I'm just summarizing here to show you the context. So in other words, first he tells you what happens during that period, and then he discusses the imminence of the beginning of that period. So he switches context. Remember, the beginning of that period is when the rapture happens, when the parousia begins, and it's the beginning of the day of the Lord in its broad sense. So let me put it to you one last way. The first half of the Olivet Discourse is all about signs that take place in the day of the Lord. And this is an answer to the disciples' second question, which started this whole discourse, about the signs of his coming. They were asking him about the signs of his coming, or literally the signs of his parousia. It's a what question. They're asking, what are the signs? So Jesus discusses the sequence of signs that take place during, not leading up to, during this period called his parousia. And the whole point is that once you start seeing these signs that take place during the broad day, after it initiates, they start. Once you start seeing those signs, it's all very predictable. So there's nothing unknown or unknowable or unpredictable or nothing about it that should take you off guard. Once you start seeing the signs, you can track exactly what's happening up until the final sign of his coming in the sky, his actual physical coming. But then in verse 36, Jesus transitions to answer the disciples' first question, which was a when question. So he's transitioning from a what to a when. So then Jesus begins to discuss the when of the parousia, the when of his coming. And everything beginning with verse 36, even going until verse 13 of the next chapter, chapter 25, is all 100% predicated all on imminence, meaning any moment. It's all about suddenness, signlessness, unpredictability. It's going to take everyone off guard, which is all the direct opposite to what he just said during the first half of the discourse. Because now he's answering their first question about the when. And his answer continues for quite some time, like I said, but it's all about imminence. His whole larger point during this entire section is that you can't know the time. Nobody can, ever. Whether you're righteous or unrighteous, because nobody will know. And in fact, even the angels and the Son of Man don't know. And his message to all is to simply watch, meaning to be spiritually prepared for him. Because if you aren't ready when he comes, you get left behind to enter the judgment that starts simultaneously. The rescue happens and immediately the judgment starts. So we're instructed to watch for him himself, not watch for signs, since there are no signs of his coming, because it's all predicated on signlessness, unpredictability. A sign is the opposite of unpredictability. A sign is the definitional opposite of sudden. Nothing that's sudden can have a sign. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sudden, because you'd see the sign and you wouldn't be taken off guard. There would be nothing sudden about it. But Jesus' entire context is here that there's nothing for you to watch except for him. You have to be on the constant lookout for him himself coming in the sky to rapture you, which again is a metaphor for spiritual preparation. Watching for Jesus means being spiritually prepared for him. And he uses the comparison of a thief coming in the night, where the whole point is that it's sudden and there are no signs of a thief because the thief relies on taking the homeowner off guard. That's the whole point. He also uses an equivalent example of the unpredictable coming or the return of a master of a house coming back at any moment suddenly and without warning and no signs. So it's all based on suddenness, which is why the Luke account also specifically speaks of the coming of this day as being like a snare coming on the whole world, a trap. But he says that the righteous in that passage, he follows that by saying that the righteous actually have a way of escaping that day. Again, the rescue of the righteous, which is an obvious early rapture reference. And all of this is the context for Jesus's usage of the Noah example, the days of Noah in the Olivet Discourse, and how he additionally uses the Lot example directly alongside it in Luke 17. So when you understand all this background, it's so easy then to understand what Jesus means by using these Noah and Lot examples and what he's meaning for us to understand by his usage. It's all about suddenness and unpredictability, imminence. Jesus is using two Old Testament examples, the coming of the flood in the days of Noah and the destruction of Sodom in the days of Lot, as a pattern, a prophetic template, as a way to express how the day of the Lord will initiate. In other words, the flood and the destruction of Sodom were past times when God stepped onto the scene and executed his sovereign will to judge men. They were sort of mini or typological days of the Lord that point forward in time to the ultimate final eschatological day of the Lord. And Jesus is using them as a pattern to teach about how this ultimate judgment event, the broad day of the Lord, is going to also initiate. So remember, he's answering the disciples' when question. He's saying the day of the Lord is going to come just as those Old Testament times of judgment came, which people of that time, his disciples and people in Judaism, were very familiar with. He was talking about something that was well known in their Jewish culture from their Old Testament. And he's using it to answer the when question. He's using it to say that it's going to happen just like those things happened, suddenly, without warning, simultaneously, where there's a rescue of the righteous while beginning a period of judgment upon the wicked who are left behind. And that's exactly why he's bringing up the days of Noah to communicate this. He's not talking about the conditions of evil that existed before the flood, as people today often confuse this with. He's not trying to say that the same conditions that existed during the days of Noah before the flood came are going to also exist during the church age before the day of the Lord happens. That's not what he's saying at all. And he's also not saying necessarily that it's going to exist even in the day of the Lord, because that's not his point. He's not talking about the conditions on earth, the evil that's rampant during that time before the flood. That's not the point. He's speaking about the manner in which the day of the Lord will begin or come or initiate. It'll begin suddenly, and it'll immediately remove the righteous, rescue the righteous, the church, while plunging the wicked who are left behind into judgment. That's the template, guys. And it's absolutely explicit in the text. I'm going to show you. And it perfectly flows along with all the imminence language that's constantly being used all throughout this section, because Jesus' usage of the days of Noah, it takes place in this section that we said is all about imminence, where that's the easy, obvious context. It's not difficult at all. That's the context. It's the imminence language that's constantly being used all throughout this section of the discourse, like the thief, the command to watch, and that nobody knows the day or the hour, and that the righteous are going to be taken while the wicked are then going to be left to enter judgment. All of this happens right at the beginning of the Perusia period, the beginning of the broad day when the rapture happens. That's the comparison. And to focus on Nephilim or anything that's happening in the world at that time or before it or after it is to totally miss Jesus's whole point. That's not the comparison. So let's go ahead and read through this passage and talk about it some more. And as we read it, we're going to break down each aspect. It's going to be so clear to you, I promise. So in Matthew 24, for example, Jesus begins the days of Noah comparison in verse 37. But in order to really understand what he's trying to get across, we need to also start by reading verse 36, which frames the context. Now remember, verse 36 is also where we said Jesus changes his context from the signs in the day of the Lord, the sequence of signs that takes you through the day of the Lord, to now he's switching to the unpredictability of the timing of the beginning of the day of the Lord. So he's switching to answer the disciples' first question about when. And he says this. He says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Okay, so he's using the Noah example directly after explaining the imminence of this time period, that it's something sudden and unpredictable. So the baseline context here is unpredictability, suddenness, the fact that it's going to arise without warning. That's the comparison. That's the context. Now I'm going to go through and break this down even further, but first I want to just put this in your mind. When we simply read the plain text here, right, reading comprehension, we can very easily see that the focus of Jesus' typological comparison is primarily on two specific aspects. Number one is the suddenness of the flood judgment upon the wicked world during a time of complete normalcy. Think of signless imminence. And number two is the simultaneous same day rescue of the righteous and judgment of the wicked. So those are the two aspects that he's conveying. Nothing about fallen angels or Nephilim activity, nothing. Okay, so let's break it down even further. As we read through this and look at it on the screen while I explain this, if you want to, it'll help. You're going to see this so clearly. So the first thing is that Jesus first conveys to us that in the times leading up to the flood, people were absorbed in lifestyles of complete normalcy. He says that they were eating, drinking, marrying, being given in marriage, and they were entirely unaware of the sudden judgment that was about to befall them. And their obliviousness is explicit here in Jesus' statement that the wicked of Noah's day knew not until the flood came. Look at the text. He's adamant about this emphasis on the routine activities of life directly prior to the judgment, which communicates the relative mundaneness of the time immediately prior to the outpouring of the judgment. There were no signs or precursors. Things were not falling apart. It's not talking about, the comparison is not all the evil that was happening during that time and that it's going to be the same at the end. That's not what it's saying at all. In fact, it's saying the direct opposite. It was life as usual. This is the opposite of the Nephilim interpretation, where these prophecy teachers are literally turning Jesus's whole point on its head and understanding it directly backwards. They're understanding it to mean that before the Perusia, the times are so wicked, and there's these alien abductions, and it's craziness happening, and the paranormal is the new normal, and there's human hybrids all over the place, and it's just as chaotic as the times before the flood. No, guys, that's the opposite of Jesus's point. He's saying it was life as usual. He's talking about the suddenness aspect. He's not saying that activity wasn't happening before the flood. He's not talking about that at all. He's not even addressing the Nephilim activity and the rampant wickedness. It's not his point. He's using the comparison to express something different altogether. But if you listen to these prophecy teachers, not only don't you understand his simple point, but you start to view the time immediately before the rapture as a time of intense craziness. And you're getting stressed out and thinking about it. And everything bad in the world means that we're almost there. And they're drawing these equivalences saying that, oh, we must be right there. No, guys, that's not even his point. He doesn't comment on how bad it's going to be in the world at that time or how bad it was during the days of Noah. That's not the point. That's not what he's after with this. There may be a level of bad in the world. There always has been. And there certainly was before the flood, obviously, which was the whole point of the flood. But his point is it will be life as usual. For whatever that means, life as usual. Doesn't mean no troubles. Doesn't mean that there's going to be no wars or anything like that. There's always been wars, guys. There's always been these bad things. His point is that it's going to take everyone by surprise because there are no signs. So whatever bad is happening in the world, you're not supposed to construe it as a sign that means that we're almost there because this was happening before the flood. That's not his point, guys. You're missing the actual point. It's that life is going to be as usual, and the coming of the Perusia and its judgment are going to be sudden and unexpected by the wicked. That's the first part. Now, the second thing is that Jesus emphasizes that this normalcy continued until the day that righteous Noah entered the ark. And then immediately that same day, as the righteous were taken out and removed, the judgment fell suddenly on the unsuspecting wicked world. So it's a pattern that involves not only a sudden, unpredictable onset, but also a simultaneous rescue of the righteous and beginning of judgment on the wicked. That's what this is about. So, guys, I'm going to read you a little quote from my book, The Missing Key. And in this quote, I say this: Jesus uses this Noahic judgment analogy to teach his disciples about the ultimate future judgment event, the broad day of the Lord, of which the judgment phase in its entirety comprises his coming, or Perusia. His entire point is to communicate that the broad day will likewise come suddenly without signs during a time of complete normalcy, and that it will simultaneously bring salvation for the righteous in a period of judgment upon the wicked. He uses the flood of Noah as a prophetic template for the broad day. The 2 points identified are the 2 points of emphasis upon which Jesus built the comparison. They are explicit in the text. So, guys, that's the simple and clear point here. And it's the same in all these passages. You can go check them out for yourself. It's also the same in the days of Lot mentions, where this is obvious since in Luke 17, Jesus uses the Lot example as a further expansion of his use of the Noah example. So he's using them equivalently. But before we close, just so that you guys know that I'm not making this stuff up, I like to show you the words of good Bible scholars, just to, again, demonstrate this isn't something that I dreamed up. Actually, the Nephilim interpretation is a crazy interpretation that somebody made up. So here's a few quotes on the subject, and all these are included in my book, along with many more. They all speak about this context of Jesus using the Noah's flood example in the Olivet Discourse. The first one is by Dr. John Hart, and he says, all of these evidences concerning the scriptural account of the flood lead to the conclusion that the days of Noah prophesy typologically the prevailing attitude that exists prior to the eschatological judgments of the day of the Lord and the pre-tribulational rapture of the church. As early as the Old Testament and confirmed in the New, the flood has become prophetically typological of the coming eschatological judgments. As the flood swept away the unsuspecting pagans of the flood era, so the unbeliever will be swept away in the unsuspecting judgment, the broad day of the Lord. And here's another quote by Dr. Robert L. Thomas, where he agrees that the Lord's purpose of using the Noah and Lot examples is to express imminence. In other words, the comparison was about the imminence of the flood, and therefore it acts as a pattern for the future day of the Lord, not Nephilim. He says this: He, referring to Christ, used the coming of the flood in Noah's day and the destruction of Sodom in Lot's day as examples of his imminent return. And I'll give you another quote from Thomas. Referring to the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, he says, after 24:36, Jesus looks at the events of the broad day of the Lord as a whole, and how the beginning of that broad day will catch everyone by surprise, with no indication that it's at the door. Jesus illustrated the complete unexpectedness of the series of events by noting the parallel of his coming to inflict wrath on the world with the way God caught the world by surprise with the flood in Noah's day. The victims did not know about it until the flood happened. That will be the case when the Son of Man returns, referring to the Parousia, or the beginning of the broad day. The world will not know until the period is underway. They will have no warnings, such as those alluded to in the parable of the fig tree. All right, so once again, when Jesus mentions the days of Noah, he doesn't have in mind anything to do with the Nephilim here. His intended meaning is explicit and obvious in the actual verse itself, in the text itself, and it's reinforced by understanding it in the backdrop of the larger context and seeing how he uses it within the flow of everything else that he's saying. He's communicating a twofold emphasis. I'll tell you again. Number one was the sudden coming of the flood judgment upon a world that was engaged in the complete routine normalcy of life. And number two, the fact that the righteous, referring to Noah and his family, were removed to a place of safety on the same day that the judgment began to fall. He's using the days of Noah as a pattern, a template for understanding how his Parousia arises, to teach that this future coming to impose his wrath is going to occur in exactly such a way during a time of otherwise normalcy, coming upon a population that was completely unaware. As the righteous are removed to safety, judgment simultaneously begins to fall upon the wicked. It's an immediate same-day occurrence, period. That's the basis of the comparison. Again, that's not to say that human hybridization or the alien agenda or anything else won't be happening during this time. It's not saying it will or won't, because it's not the point. It's remote from anything Jesus is intending for us to understand. And the sad part of that is that nobody is saying what I'm teaching you here today. Nobody's talking about the real context. But you'll often hear people talking about the Nephilim and the days of Noah, so much so that when you read this verse, your mind right away goes to the Nephilim explanation, and you miss the simple truth that's so obvious right in the actual text. See, guys, that's the danger of sensationalism and reading things into the scriptures. It guarantees that you're not going to understand what the actual text says, what the actual scriptures are saying to you, and what God actually wants you to take away from it. And that's why I caution you to be careful about who you're following. There's a lot of nonsense on the internet, as I hope you know. So I hope you guys got something out of this. I hope that I was able to help you to see the words of Jesus in a more biblical way and less in a prophecy entertainment sort of a way. So God bless you guys, and I will see you on the next video.